Hello, my name is Aaron Marvel, and welcome to episode 6 in our series over Assessment for Learning. In this episode, we will be talking about how to get students involved. Our objectives for this lesson are first to refocus our actions on student learning rather than teacher teaching, and second, to give several examples of how students can become more involved in their own assessment for learning throughout the learning process. This short lesson will reiterate some points made in previous lessons just more explicitly and will hopefully give some new perspectives on student involvement when it comes to their own assessment. Teaching can be summed up simply in 3 questions that teachers ask year by year, unit by unit, week by week, day by day, and minute by minute. First, what knowledge and skills do my students currently have? In other words, where are they? Second, what are the learning targets that they need to know, or where are they going? And lastly, what are some of the best ways that I can teach them this content? Or asked another way, how do I get them there? In every situation, teachers need to know the answers to these questions in order to make decisions about how to proceed to the next year, unit, or class. Imagine trying to plan a lesson without knowing where your students currently are in their understanding. You may be teaching students to record temperatures before they even know how to describe the temperature as hot or cold. Or you might be teaching students sight words before they even know all their letters. These practices would only frustrate students and yield little to no learning. Similarly, imagine planning a lesson without knowing the intended learning outcomes. This is equivalent to hitting a moving target blindfolded. Now, let's change our perspective to an even more productive one. There are many that say teaching and learning are not the same thing, nor do they always happen simultaneously. The world of education is making an important shift from what and how teachers teach to instead what and how students learn, a remarkably more important question to ask. So, let's focus our questions instead on student learning. Instead, let's help students ask the questions, where am I? Where am I going? And how do I get there? If we never help students acquire the skills necessary to answer these questions, after all, how can we expect them to become independent learners? And just as importantly, how can we expect students to learn efficiently without knowing how to answer these questions? Just as before, imagine trying to learn anything without knowing where you currently are in your learning journey, or without knowing what you are learning, or without knowing the best way to get there. Learning would become a frustrating endeavor that only leads to a hatred for learning and a sense of helplessness. The next 3 slides will give examples of how we as educators can help students learn to answer these 3 questions of the learning process. So, where am I? The first question in a student's learning journey. This important question helps students access background knowledge and prepares them to set goals for their own learning. To help students answer this question, teachers can guide students in evaluating their past and present work. This was discussed in episode 5 in relation to learning targets. 2 examples of students evaluating their present and past work include keeping a growth portfolio and writing reflections on observations, and comparing their own work with other student work or a masterful example. When a student sees areas where he has improved, defining where he currently is in his learning journey becomes much easier to explain, especially if portfolios are used to keep track of growth. Portfolios will also be discussed further in a future episode. Students should also reflect on learning. This can easily be done by keeping a learning log or journal. Journals can be a wonderful place to engage students in metacognitive thinking that encourages thinking about effective learning strategies in particular circumstances and determine if learning has even occurred. As discussed in episode 5, answering these questions can also help students develop more sophisticated epistemic beliefs about what knowledge actually is. Journals are also a great place to reflect on how a student feels about particular learning experiences by answering questions like, what did you find frustrating about this lesson? Our last example of helping students answer the question, where am I, is receiving feedback from peers and teachers. Often, teachers and other students may be able to look at evidence of learning and see areas of needed improvement or areas of excellence better than the learner herself. Evaluating other work also gives students an opportunity to engage in one of the higher of the thinking skills. Episode 8 will discuss the construction of rubrics and how these can help students evaluate their own work and the work of others. So let's move on to our second question. Where am I going? This question is a precursor to question 3, how do I get there, as question 3 cannot be answered without the answer to question 2. To answer where am I going, teachers should engage students in conversations about learning targets. Episode 5 talks extensively about learning targets and gives several examples of how to integrate them into your lesson. 2 of these examples involve defining key academic words within the learning target and also creating success criteria for the learning targets. These are processes that should not be done by the teacher in isolation, but a joint effort to help students construct their own understanding of mastery. Students should also be evaluating masterful work. The language and learning targets for students is often too ambiguous and abstract to imagine what quality work looks like. Simply providing opportunities to discuss masterful work and comparing to current work can do wonders to help students see where they're going in their learning. Once students can define where they are in their learning and have a clear picture of where they are going, they can begin setting goals. According to Stiggins, Arter, Chapuis, and Chapuis, setting goals requires students to answer 3 questions. First, what do I need to work on? Second, what is my plan? And third, who will I ask to help me? In the current step of the learning process, we must answer, what do I need to work on? An easy question to answer once students see where they currently are in their learning journey and where they are heading. The questions, what is my plan, and who will I ask to help me, will be answered in our third step of the learning process, how do I get there? To answer how to arrive at a learning target, students must decide what their next steps are, which can be discovered through past reflections to determine historically what has worked best for them in particular circumstances. A student might find that he does particularly well with information he must remember when he creates mnemonics. Therefore, he would include the strategy in the goal he sets for himself. Teachers are also a great source of information when it comes to learning strategies, as they often must be explicitly taught. Students often don't know to use a graphic organizer or to create a concept map for particular learning circumstances. Often, student peers also have innovative ways and strategies to learn particular concepts. Give your students opportunities to collaborate on how they will proceed in learning the learning target at hand. These conversations will most likely be very difficult for students in the beginning as they are not accustomed to talking about learning and study strategies, but with time it will become easier. Lastly, students should include a plan or an approach to mastering the learning target at hand. For example, a student might say that they will use a mnemonic to memorize the taxonomy of living organisms, or they might say that they will take notes on important ideas and summarize each chapter after reading. Getting students more involved with their learning may seem like more work on our part as educators, but I truly believe a change in perspective will not give teachers more work, but it will only lead them into a different kind of work, one of helping students construct knowledge rather than trying to dump it from one brain to another. Just recently, I read a tweet that resonated with me, shared by John Wink. It said, "If all kids one day score at the very highest level but hate learning in school, we will have failed as a profession." Helping students become more involved with their learning will inevitably teach them to take ownership of their learning and hence create lifelong learners. In this lesson, we refocused our actions on student learning rather than teacher teaching and gave examples of how students can become involved in their own assessment for learning. I hope you enjoyed episode 6 of Assessment for Learning. I will see you next time.